The Demon Corps has already claimed the life of one man, Harry Daghlian. As he lay dying in a hospital bed, one man sat at his bedside for many hours, caring for him. This man was 34-year-old Louis Slotin, a Canadian physicist who came to Los Alamos to assist in the Manhattan Project. Slotin was the man who put the core of Gadget together, for which he earned the nickname Chief Armourer of the United States. Slotin was the right man for this job. At Los Alamos, he'd been renowned for being involved in these near-critical experiments, including the type that had claimed Daghlian's life. Over time, however, the criticality experiments were modified and refined by Los Alamos scientists, Slotin being one of them. 2 beryllium hemispheres, the neutron reflectors, would be placed around the core, with wooden blocks separating them. The procedures called to gradually decrease the size of the blocks, bringing the 2 hemispheres closer and closer together until they were approaching criticality, still testing the same things as Daghlian months earlier. In the end, Slotin performed this experiment more than 25 times, and became somewhat of an expert at it. He also modified it, using a screwdriver in place of the blocks. Tilting the screwdriver up and down brought the 2 hemispheres further apart or closer together respectively. It was this bravado that led to Enrico Fermi, the creator of the world's first nuclear reactor, warning Slotin that he'd be dead in a year if he kept doing the experiment like this. Enter 1946, and the US Navy has announced their plans to conduct experimental nuclear detonations at sea, using a mixture of surplus American ships, surrendered Axis ships, and thousands of live animals. By this point, Los Alamos had produced 4 more hemispheres, bringing them up to 3 cores that can be used in atomic bombs. Slotin was, unfortunately for him, roped into these experiments, as one of the few people actually capable and experienced in assembling the plutonium masses into the bombs. He was also responsible for keeping an eye on them and getting them to Bikini Atoll, where they would be exploded, and also training Alvin Graves, his replacement, freeing him up to return to lecturing at universities. This was his real passion. And this brings us to the 21st of May, exactly 9 months after Daghlian irradiated himself fatally. Rufus and the 2 other cores were in a small lab, and some scientists were milling about, for example Raymond Schreiber and Theodore Perlman, conducting measurements of the radioactivity of some of the material in the room, and then entered Slotin at around 3:10 in the afternoon. With him were Graves and a few other men who were touring the site, including a photographer and young physicists. At some point in the conversation, criticality tests were brought up, and Graves asked for a demonstration. He wanted to conduct some when Slotin was travelling to supervise Operation Crossroads, and at least wanted a demonstration of the technique. Slotin refused, as he didn't think there were any cores in the building. But then they remembered the cores had been brought into that very building that very morning. Slotin said he would wait for Schreiber and Perlman to finish their experiments, and then he would demonstrate the criticality experiment in, quote, about 2 minutes, end quote. Schreiber told Slotin that if he was going to do it in just 2 minutes, he would leave the building, but would stay around if he did it in half an hour. This was a joke. Schreiber was confident in Slotin's abilities. At 3:15 p.m, Schreiber finished his experiment, and told Slotin to start on his own. Schreiber went to check the radioactivity of the initiator of the atomic bombs, a polonium-beryllium sphere that would sit inside the plutonium sphere to produce the initial neutrons for criticality when the sphere is imploded. Meanwhile, Slotin had set up a neutron source of plutonium and beryllium, and the two hemispheres of Rufus inside the beryllium hemispheres, as he had done so many times before. Using the screwdriver, Slotin raised the upper hemisphere and lowered it, showing how the number of neutrons produced were multiplied as the two reflectors came together. Samuel Klein and Marian Siliski were monitoring two neutron counters, watching them for some actual numbers from the experiment. Schreiber assumed it would take a long time for them to reach any high numbers, so he continued to work on his monitoring until he heard a loud smack behind him. It was 3:20 p.m. Slotin's right hand had slipped. The screwdriver fell out of the gap, and the beryllium hemisphere fell on top of Rufus. And nothing should have happened. There shouldn't have been enough neutrons reflected by the beryllium to sustain a criticality, except for Slotin's left hand, resting on top of the thumb hole. As shown in a study in 2018, his hand provided enough neutron reflection to push the demon core into a prompt critical state. A blue light shone out from the thumb hole and the small gap around the equator of the setup, and the scientists in the room felt a sudden heat wave burst out from within the beryllium spheres. Slotin's mouth filled with a sour taste, and his left hand, the one acting as a neutron reflector, began to burn. This caused Slotin's hand to reflectively jerk upwards, pulling the upper hemisphere of the setup off the core, and sending it clattering onto the floor. The fission reaction was terminated, but the radioactivity around the core, gamma rays in particular, remained. In less than a second, the criticality was already over. Panic set in. In a few seconds, engineer Theodore Perlman had fled the room, running up the adjacent corridor to what he thought was a safe distance. Meanwhile, Samuel Klein, Marian Siliski, Dwight Young, and the security guard, Patrick Cleary, had taken a door to the east of the room, leading outside, and Klein flagged the military police, alerting them. The officer struggled to grab his whistle, and then he opened the gate and blew his whistle. Everyone ran some 1,000 feet, or 300 meters, up the road to what they thought was a safe distance. Only Slotin, Graves, and Schreiber remained. The silence was interrupted by Slotin. "Well, that does it. I'm dead." Then the three left the room, into the corridor with Perlman. Slotin telephoned for an ambulance, and began to sketch out the room, drawing where people were. Quickly, they went back in to try and use a Watts ionization chamber meter, but the meter itself was too active and was obscuring the measurements. They left the room again for a few minutes. Slotin had lapsed into brain fog after the accident, and turned to Schreiber, asking him to take some of the dosimetry badges from the safe and place them on Rufus. Slotin thought that this would allow them to estimate the radiation dose they absorbed. In reality, this was meaningless, and only caused a higher dose to Schreiber. Meanwhile, Slotin and Perlman went outside and called out to the four men who fled the room, and ran up the road, telling them to come back. Together, everyone sketched out where they had been stood in relation to the experiment gone wrong, and then who got the most radiation out of them all. In the end, that was obvious. It was Slotin. Schreiber constantly went in and out of the room, checking the measurements for radiation, most of which were off the scale, and he began to warn people not to enter the room, to stay away for their own safety. When the ambulance arrived for Slotin, Schreiber called in for replacements, ordering one of them to wait in the corridor and one outside the building, but never to enter for their own safety. In the ambulance, Slotin began to experience the first symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, like his friend Daghlian had 9 months earlier to the day. He began to feel nauseous and vomited a few times, but by the time he got to hospital, this settled. His skin was tanned, but from constant days out in the New Mexico sun, not from the radiation exposure he just received. His pulse was just over 100 beats per minute. His body temperature just broke over 100 Fahrenheit, or 37.8 degrees Celsius, above a normal level, but his blood pressure was still in an ideal range. 3 hours after exposure, the physical injuries of radiation poisoning began to emerge. His left hand turned red and began to swell up, and his nail beds turned blue. He was following the course of his friend Daghlian. The same hand turned numb, and his thumb began to tingle. The next day, his swelling firmed up, progressing further up his forearm over the coming hours, and the tingling sensation in his thumb turned to a burning across his entire hand. His right hand also swelled up, turning red. These were the two closest parts of his body to the core when the criticality occurred. To treat these, doctors attempted to use ice packs to ease the swelling. On day 3, the redness of his left arm gave way to a blue-purple colour of poor circulation, the skin turning hard and waxy. Swelling also began to form in the subcutaneous layers of his thighs and his torso, restricting his ability to move his leg. They began to administer painkillers to help ease his suffering. Over days 4 and 5, the severity of the situation became alarmingly clear. His white blood cell count plummeted to 0, meaning his hematopoietic stem cells were dead. He was now highly susceptible to any infections. Blood transfusions began to replace his white blood cells, which would need to occur continuously during treatment, and he was administered penicillin as well. The reddening and blistering of his skin progressed around the left side of his pelvis, and Slotin complained of terrible pain in his groin, but there were no signs of injury there. On day 6, a bowel obstruction formed in Slotin's intestines, which caused things to come out the other way in a horrible vomit filled with blood. They tried to unblock his intestine to no avail, and Slotin lost his appetite, becoming physically weak. It was clear to everyone the end was almost near. Around this time, Slotin called his parents, Israel and Sonia Slotin, and told them he'd been in an accident. Slotin's friend, Philip Morrison, was at his bedside. He later recalled, quote, "With a nurse holding the receiver, he telephoned his family to tell them he had been in an accident, that he would be in hospital for a time. Since he couldn't visit them, perhaps, he suggested, his parents would come see him." End quote. On day 7, Slotin's degradation was only accelerated. Slotin's fever spiked to a high temperature, and his pulse rate rapidly increased. It was likely an infection had set in. A bloody, uncontrollable diarrhea had also begun. But worst of all was the lack of oxygen reaching his body, manifesting physically through his blue lips, and mentally in confusion and delirium. Fluids and glucose were administered intravenously, and Slotin was moved to an oxygen tent in the hope it would increase his oxygen percentage. The next day, the bloody diarrhea continued to worsen, and it became obvious that Slotin was going to die soon. His heartbeat grew fainter, weaker, his breathing quicker, shallower. It was impossible to measure his blood pressure, as it caused incredible agony placing the cuff on. In just one day, Slotin received 4 pints of blood, 8 litres of fluid, and 2 litres of blood plasma in transfusions. On day 9, 30th of May 1946, Slotin's skin had completely transformed into a jaundice yellow, and he finally entered the final stages. Like Daghlian, he slipped into a coma. Transfusions were maintained to keep him comfortable, and finally Slotin passed away, peacefully and quietly. Slotin's body was left unrecognisable. Hair loss had ravaged his head and torso. Dry gangrene had affected his fingers, and ulcers had filled the inside of his mouth. With the permission of his family, as it went against their Jewish beliefs, and would result in criticism back home, an autopsy was performed. Slotin was opened up, and his organs were examined. The lining of Slotin's heart had swollen up, and his heart itself had enlarged, and there was evidence his left ventricle had hemorrhaged. His lungs were filled with fluid, which would have hampered his ability to breathe and absorb oxygen into his blood. In his abdomen, his liver and spleen were also enlarged and described as flabby, while his intestines were also swelled up. There was evidence of dead kidney tissue, due to a lack of blood supply. And then when they extracted some bone marrow, they found it watery and depleted of any hematopoietic stem cells, the cells that produce white blood cells. And then there was Graves, stood immediately behind Slotin and likely saved only by virtue of being shielded from the neutron and gamma rays by Slotin himself. When the two of them arrived to hospital, Slotin apologised and hoped Graves would have better chances than he would. As it turned out, he did. Graves was discharged 2 weeks after exposure, with the worst symptom arising being a nosebleed. There was also physical weakness and hair loss that eventually recovered. The other people in the room would all recover equally as fast. All of them were asymptomatic at the time and showed no abnormalities in their health at the time. Samuel Klein, designated Case 5 in early studies of acute radiation sickness, with Harry Daghlian being 1, the security guard Hempelmann being 2, Slotin 3, and Graves 4, refused to participate in any follow-up tests. He died in 2001, aged 81. Photographer Dwight Young, 54 at the time, was nicknamed Case 6. Young would live well into his 80s, dying of a heart attack brought on by heart failure and E. coli-induced sepsis on Christmas Eve 1975. Young also developed anemia in his later years, though no cause was ever found. Case 7, Patrick Cleary, did not live long enough to be observed for any related illnesses. Promoted to sergeant, he was killed defending the front line around Busan against North Korea during the Korean War on September 3rd, 1950. He is buried in the Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York, the same town where he was born. He was just 24. Case 8, Marian Sislicki, was in great health until 1964, when what was assumed to be sinusitis turned out in fact to be leukemia. After an attempted treatment, which was somewhat successful, there was a rapid deterioration, and, on July 18, 1965, he suffered a fatal grand mal seizure. On autopsy, cancerous growths were reportedly found in every organ. And, as for Theodore Perlman and Raymond Schreiber, the furthest from the accident, they both suffered minimal exposure, and lived to 1988 and 1998 respectively, in good health. This accident ended the hands-on testing of critical objects. All further testing was conducted with remote control from more than a kilometre away. Nobody would be in the danger zone, and the Demon Core was now too hot to transport to Bikini Atoll. On July 1st, 1946, a younger twin of what was now widely being called the Demon Core was detonated in Bikini Atoll as part of Crossroads Able. On July 25th, the experiment Crossroads Baker followed, also a younger twin. The contamination caused by Baker, an underwater blast, was immense and made cleaning the ships involved nigh impossible. As a result, there were no ships available to make testing the third bomb, part of Crossroads Charlie, feasible. The Demon Core did not have a purpose. It was old, it had already been involved in 2 accidental radiation events, which had reduced the purity of the plutonium, and it just wasn't needed anymore. Scientists generally aren't superstitious. Aside from the name, they didn't give the Demon Core any special treatment for its involvement in the deaths of 2 of the brightest minds at Los Alamos. It just wasn't a usable core anymore. And so it was melted down in the summer of 1946, with the plutonium reused and recast into at most 50 new plutonium spheres. Most of this would have ended up in the Mark III Mod 0 nuclear bombs, a modification of the Fat Man device, and other modernizations. Perhaps some of it was used in Operation Sandstone, where the explosions can be described as beautiful. Supervising this was none other than Alvin Graves, who would go on to supervise many nuclear tests. Following his exposure to radiation by the Demon Core and his subsequent recovery, Graves would become dismissive of radiation exposure and contamination, going on press tours calling it concocted in the minds of weak maligners, and telling the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy that the danger of cancer from radioactive fallout was, quote, "Not that this will happen to you. The danger is that it is more likely to happen to you. Maybe the more likely is not very much more likely, but it is still more likely." End quote. When Graves did eventually die, he too was autopsied, and his remains studied in pursuit of understanding radiation sickness. Despite being shielded by Slotin, he had not escaped some of the symptoms of the man who saved his life. His heart had been massively enlarged, whereas his thyroid gland was so atrophied they struggled to find it. Most of it had been replaced with scar tissue. And that's where the story of the Demon Core ends. Born for war, it saw only violence, albeit from the errors of the scientists who birthed it. In the end, it went out in not one, but several flashes brighter than the sun, and clouds of radioactive smoke that, one day, may have gone on to claim further lives. The Los Alamos newspaper gave a tribute to Slotin, containing a poem which I feel is worthy to end the story. May God receive you, great-souled scientist. While you were with us, even strangers knew the breadth and lofty stature of your mind. 'Twas only in the crucible of death we saw at last your noble heart revealed.